Hello, lovelies! You're listening to episode 2 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I would love to connect with you on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can check out the links below. Now let's get to the story. The evening fire had already been lit, though the sun was still well above the horizon. Janir took in her reflection, hoping she looked presentable. It had been nearly 7 years since she had first met Armandius. At times, she couldn't remember what Adasha had been like at all. Sometimes it seemed she had been born in this castle. The ancient walls grayed by age, the rolling wheat fields and sloping hills beyond were more home than the citadel of the Argatolums had ever been. A smallish, round woman in a matron's wimple peered over her shoulder. "Don't you dare move yet," she said with mock severity, wielding a comb through Janir's hair with a practiced efficiency. "You might dash about like a hooligan on most days, but tonight, there you are, sweetheart." The matron affectionately patted Janir's head, setting down the boar's hairbrush. She stood and admired her work. "Thank you." Janir was a little surprised at the transformation. She saw a young noblewoman in that mirror. A proper lady. "No charge of mine shall go about looking as if you romp in the fields all day," the old lady added proudly. "Even if you do. See? I told you getting dressed up for these kinds of guests wouldn't be so horrible." "You've done wonderfully, Dame Celila." Janir fought the urge to touch her carefully arranged locks. She didn't want to muss them. "Would you mind telling his lordship that I will be down soon?" Dame Celila nodded and scurried away to inform Armandius. Her pattering steps faded down the hall and Janir was alone. Thankfully, Janir had taken after her mother. She could easily be taken for Brevian. Snatching up a necklace from the dresser, Janir fastened it in place. A silver medallion hung several inches below her throat. It was a 7-point star with a solid emerald in the center. The points were formed by the interlocking pattern of 7 tiny swords, the emblem of the Caerson house. Armandius had given her the medallion on the day he had brought her here to his castle. She had been frightened and timid, a motherless and defenseless child. Armandius had hung the chain around her neck and said, "You are part of my family now." Janir bit her lip. She knew she was not Armandius's daughter, but how she wished she was. Wedged between the mirror and the wall, where it had stayed for months, sat a polished mahogany box. Armandius had given it to her just last year. He'd said it had been in her pony's saddlebags when he found her, and she might want it some day, but should keep it hidden. He'd offered no further explanation, and she still didn't know what was inside. Never had she found the courage to look. There were times, like right now, she felt a tremor in the air, a pull toward the box. She lightly touched the side of the shiny lid, just enough to stir the dust that had settled since the maid's last visit. Those girls dusted around the box, thinking it was part of the mirror, clueless as Janir as to what might be inside. Armandius had once told her that hiding things in plain sight was the best. "Open me." It was hardly there, a hazy concept of thought that her mind translated into words. The moment the familiar beckoning voice came, Janir jerked her hand away as if the box were poisonous. "No," Janir snapped out loud. It was a constant reminder of her Argatolum blood. Janir hated the very sight of it, yet something deep within her, some innate instinct perhaps, was loath to throw it out. Therefore, it had remained in its current location for nearly a year. Smoothing the front of her blue silk dress, Janir realized that she could no longer stall. The man she called father had guests tonight, and it would be unseemly to delay any longer. Turning on her heel, Janir strode to the oaken door and slipped into the long corridor lit by flickering torches. She made her way along the hall, shoes clacking against the stone. It was not long before Janir arrived at a pair of imposing double doors at the end of a corridor. After briefly making sure that everything on her was in order, she placed a hand on the door and swung it open. The interior scene was unusual for this castle, though it might have been considered normal in any other. Armandius stood with a polite but strained expression as a thin, powdered, and perfumed young woman giggled and tittered. The woman had enough lace around her neck to have been a milkweed, and a skirt to house a family of martins. Beside her was a bored-looking man only slightly older. The man appeared to be unremarkable in every way except for his slit mouth. He kept contorting and pursing his lips as if he were waiting for something that was behind schedule. Janir did not spend an excessive amount of time surveying the two mortal guests. Her gaze was immediately drawn to the elf, standing slightly to one side and staring at her. Janir almost gulped when she spotted Velasquez. She suspected that his frequent visits, which, according to the older staff, previously only occurred every few years or so, were planned to check on her. "The servants know and tell all," was a proverb that Armandius had once quoted. Janir could only hope and pray that none of them suspected her secret. Janir always felt that she was on trial when Velasquez came, like there was some forgotten evil she had committed and he was just waiting for the perfect moment to expose her crime. However, it was hard to wholly dread Velasquez's visits, when that was the only time she saw his son, Seovan. To her disappointment, Seovan was nowhere to be seen. She'd heard he might return from an errand for his father early tonight, but it was unlikely. Still, she was sure Seovan would make time to visit with her and Armandius at some point. He usually did. As one of the very small number of people she had truly managed to befriend, he was always a welcome sight. Velasquez did not so much as nod when their gazes met. He stared at her with a blank expression that spoke more than 1,000 words. If it were not for Armandius, Velasquez would have killed her at the Norwind Pass, the mountain road where they had found her. Janir's hand conscientiously went up to the left side of her neck, where all that remained of the wound was a faint scar. She admitted to herself that Velasquez had saved her life that day. Still, he had only done it to keep her alive long enough for questioning. There had been no other survivors. Armandius heard the doors and whirled around, visibly elated at an excuse not to look at the prattling woman behind him. "Jenny." Armandius smiled, using his pet name for her. "You're late, child." His tone was chastising, but Janir knew that it was more for abandoning him with the giggling little doxy than for her tardiness. "Forgive me, father." Janir tried to block the girlish grin that threatened to spread across her face. Father. That was what she had called him ever since the Norwind Pass. That had been a rather abrupt choice, made when they'd stopped at another lord's manor on the way to Castle Caerson. Armandius made a split-second decision to introduce her as his illegitimate daughter, and the story had stuck ever since. Not even Dame Celila knew the truth. Armandius clasped Janir's hands and kissed her forehead. "Duke Ronan, Lady Rowella," Armandius addressed his guests. "Would you kindly allow me to present my natural daughter, Lady Janir Caerson?" The woman, Lady Rowella, smiled her artificial smile and curtsied in the most sumptuous fashion. Duke Ronan made a bored gesture. "Why do you not curtsy, child?" Lady Rowella inquired in her high-pitched squeak of a voice. "I never learned, my lady," Janir said uncomfortably. "But you have been raised by Lord Armandius Caerson, one of the finest lords in all of Brevia. Surely he taught you manners," the noblewoman trilled. "Does my father strike you as the kind of man who knows how to curtsy?" It was out before Janir could stop it. Armandius allowed a strangled smile before assuming a rebuking frown. Duke Ronan remained unbearably expressionless, while Lady Rowella stood looking baffled. "Forgive Janir," Armandius apologized. "It is not often that we have guests." From the wall behind Armandius, a door creaked open and a demure boy of about 10 peered out into the foyer. "Excuse me, my lord," the page interrupted. "Dinner is served." Armandius acknowledged the boy perfunctorily. "Thank you." The 5 of them filed into Armandius's banquet hall. It was well lit and spacious, like most of Castle Caerson. Simple tapestries adorned the walls, and the table was of a rather plain design. Janir knew that theirs was not the most ornate banquet hall, but she treasured it along with the rest of the castle's furnishings for one reason. "Oh my!" Lady Rowella was quite obviously displeased with the hall. "How quaint!" She feigned a smile. "But when was the last time you redecorated?" 22 years ago, Armandius answered simply. Janir seethed with possessive jealousy when Lady Rowella took her usual place next to Armandius, and she found herself settled directly across from Velasquez. The girl looked down at her plate to avoid his unnerving stare. From the head of the table, Armandius tried to engage Duke Ronan in conversation out of courtesy. Nonetheless, the Duke's sister talked enough for the both of them, and Armandius soon realized that the Duke wished to remain silent. "Really, Lord Caerson," Lady Rowella lamented, "this place looks rather dreary, if you don't mind my saying so." "What's wrong with it?" Janir demanded. Armandius shot her a look across the table, and she realized she had spoken out of turn. He might let her speak freely when it was just them, but any proper lord's daughter, even an illegitimate one, would have known better. Janir ducked in embarrassment, but was this woman trying to get Armandius to let her help with the castle decoration? If so, Janir wouldn't stand for such a thing. But everyone ignored her. "Are you certain that the castle isn't lacking?" Janir noticed Lady Rowella's hand inching across the table toward Armandius. "A feminine touch, perhaps?" Lady Rowella completed in a breathy voice, laying her hand over his in a disconcerting gesture. Janir nearly gagged on her piece of wild boar. "There are females all around me," Armandius deftly replied. "Janir, my late steward's widow." "Servants and children," Lady Rowella countered. "Not at all the companionship a man, such as yourself." Lady Rowella leaned closer to Armandius. Armandius leaned away from Rowella. "Tell me, Lord Caerson." Rowella was speaking in a tone Janir had never heard a noblewoman use before. Not that she had met many of those. Velasquez looked almost bemused, while Duke Ronan seemed to be thoroughly absorbed in his slice of venison. Armandius stared at Rowella with the displeased expression he had sometimes used when chastising Janir. Without a word, he pulled his hand from beneath Rowella's and returned to his plate. Janir stared at the gold band with an intricate weave pattern he always wore on his left hand. All that time, living as a widower, and he still wore it. "You say you last decorated 22 years ago?" Rowella tried to strike up a conversation she could follow. "What was the occasion?" Armandius turned a stiff gaze to Rowella. "Ariana Melliard was brought here as my newlywed wife." Janir grew even more uncomfortable, if that was possible. Her mother was a nearly forbidden subject, even with her. What would Armandius make of a relative stranger causing her to be brought up? So frivolously, too. "Well," Rowella seemed to take no notice, "that was quite a while ago. Have you ever considered remarrying?" Janir felt sick. Was this actually happening? At dinner, of all places? She whispered a prayer, pleading that this was a nightmare and she would wake up. "I admit I have," Armandius quietly replied, speaking more to himself than to the chattering little twit at his left. He glanced to Janir for a moment before continuing. "But all the women deemed suitable for marital purposes would either be too old to bear heirs to the house of Caerson or too young to be tolerable." Armandius stared hard at Rowella as he uttered the final sentence. While Janir hoped he didn't find all young women to be as abrasive as Rowella, the noblewoman herself apparently had no sense of subtlety. "But perhaps there could be one who you would find tolerable, maybe even enjoyable." Rowella had taken on that same disturbing tone in her last few words. Armandius was clearly not enjoying Rowella's advances. Still, the wench seemed not to notice. That night's dinner was proving to be one of the most awkward meals Janir had had in her lifetime. Listening to Rowella's nauseating talk while pretending to still hold an interest for food was its own challenge. By the second course, Janir was longing for Rowella to choke on something. Maybe the piece of lamb she was sliding around her plate, but no. Rowella took such small bites that a rat couldn't have choked if it tried. After dinner, Janir and Armandius would normally go up to his study and play a game of chess. Armandius always won, indisputably, but Janir still enjoyed trying to defeat the veteran knight. Besides, she was getting better. Just a bit more practice, and she was sure she would manage victory, eventually. That would not be happening this evening because they had guests. Instead, Janir found herself in Armandius' study beside the fireplace, seated on the floor cushion with a pair of deerhounds. Being with the dogs was not the problem itself. What had driven her off the couch was. Rowella still seemed clueless as to Armandius' rejection of her. Better to be in the company of a four-legged brachet than a two-legged one. Janir fondled the ears of the nearest hound, Ronnie. Ronnie was a seasoned hunting dog, and one of many in Armandius' kennel that hadn't had a name until Janir came to the castle. Ronnie yawned and rested his flecked muzzle between his front paws. Even the animals were tiring of their guests. Velasquez leaned against one side of the fireplace, staring into the flames contemplatively. He had hardly spoken to anyone all evening. Janir was wondering what point there was in him being here at all. Perhaps he simply wanted to make sure no one suspected what Janir was. After keeping her secret for 7 years, he was more or less implicit. Janir often wondered why he had elected not to expose her. She thought it must be a sense of debt to an old friend. He and Armandius had known one another for decades. Why else would he have endured her existence? Struggling to maintain a gracious outer appearance, Armandius continued to tolerate their guests. Duke Ronan still held that impatient air. Words drizzled into silence, or rather, everyone else's words fell to silence. Rowella was perfectly happy to keep talking on her own. Would anyone like some wine? Armandius cast a longing gaze in the direction of the cabinets. That would be lovely, Rowella trilled. Yes, Duke Ronan blandly added. And I think I will be needing some, Armandius muttered to himself. Call the servants to get it, Rowella suggested. No, Armandius protested. I can manage myself. He leapt up from his seat as if it were on fire, exploiting the opportunity to put space between them. Well, are you not sweet? She chirped. Briefly locking stares with Janir, Armandius rolled his eyes dramatically, and she had to stifle a giggle. He probably had the worst of it. At least she didn't have to personally contend with that woman's ill-contrived efforts at husband hunting. Armandius made his way to the wine cabinet across the room. Once his back was turned, Duke Ronan seemed to spring to life. The Duke stopped staring off into space and snapped around to Armandius. Janir's back straightened. It felt wrong. Rowella was talking about something insipid. Ronan moved to follow Armandius. Janir clambered to her feet. A niggling voice in the back of her skull said something was amiss. From behind Armandius, Ronan drew a gleaming dagger from the folds of his doublet. The blade flashed in the firelight as it rose above his head. Armandius's back was turned. Velasquez didn't see. No! Janir screamed. That distracted the Duke from plunging the dagger into Armandius's back just long enough for Janir to fling herself at Ronan. What she planned to do, she couldn't be sure. She lunged for the Duke's upraised hand, foolishly trying to wrest the blade from his fist. Instead of using the dagger on Janir, Ronan struck her with the back of his hand and made a lunge to stab Armandius. Something shook Janir from the inside. A bright green light went over her eyes, and her efforts to fight it were useless. A force commandeered her actions. She was no longer in control. Janir felt anger, blinding and powerful, such as she'd never felt before, untainted and uncontrollable ire. Letting out a mad cry, she sprang at Duke Ronan with an inhuman fury. Snatching his head with both hands, she snapped his head to one side. She felt his spine twist and crack like dried twigs. The dagger fell to the ground, and his limp body followed. This has been the Broken Enchantments podcast. Thank you for listening. Check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.